agreed very generously to introduce himself because I'm not very good at it. Richard, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, look, thank you for inviting me. I seem to get more invitations from Scotland these days than I do from anywhere else. Although I've just literally, whilst that introduction was playing, received another invitation to do a talk not dissimilar to this for the Liberal Democrats. So there we go. I'll have to talk about politics. I've been around for a while, as is fairly obvious from the white hair and the bit greying beard, which seems to be, you know, the necessary condition for being on Zoom these days. When you're of my age, roughly speaking, I'm 62. I've been involved with green issues and around environmental issues for a long time. In fact, I think this was the first ever book I read on economics and environmentalism. The book is The Costs of Economic Growth by a man called E.J. Mission, who is long dead. I bought this copy in 1973, so it says. So I was at the grand old age of 15 and reading original economic books on economics and growth. I moved on to things like E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. That's the 1975 edition, I think. Before I went to university, and then I studied economics. And then we have John Maynard Keynes, who influences still a lot of my thinking. And I became a chartered accountant. Now that's a big cross to bear. But that's what I decided I wanted to do, how I wanted to turn my political activism into something real. And that is not a normal route for somebody who becomes a chartered accountant. In fact, it's a decidedly rare way for somebody to actually look at becoming a political activist. But my dog is going mad outside the door. If you can hear a lot of barking, I've no idea why, but he thinks he wants to be in on this call, clearly. He's not coming in. So I became a chartered accountant. I trained with a large firm, KPMG. I then set up my own firm. I ran real businesses. My roots are therefore in the real business economy. I understand what it's like to actually work in the real economy, which is incredibly important, I think, when you also become a theorist and a campaigner, which, let's be blunt, I have been. I decided at around the age of 40 that I was going to be doing something different. I wasn't quite sure what. The outcome of that, I'm going to do something different, was the Tax Justice Network. And from 2003 really until 2015, I guess I was most associated with tax campaigning. But in 2008, I was one of the co-authors of the Green New Deal, the group who were London-centred, although I wasn't living in London, but London-centred, who created the ideas that have since become the Green New Deal. And if you now hear, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about the Green New Deal, she is actually talking about the ideas that we wrote in Ann Pettifor's flat and have developed ever since. And I have worked heavily on that ever since then to keep the idea alive, when particularly from 2012 to 2017, frankly, nobody was interested at all. By chance, I became a professor at City University, but now mainly at Sheffield University. And I have professorships in sustainability, economics and accountancy, which is kind of weird. I have no PhD in any of those subjects, but I do write academic papers around those areas. When I began to research a book which I wrote in 2015 and which came out a little early because Jeremy Corbyn adopted me at the time and my publisher saw that as an opportunity to sell a great many books, I wrote a book called The Joy of Tax. Most of you will understand the pun in the title. I have to explain it to students and tell them that tax is actually the most interesting three-letter word ending in X in the English language, at which point they realize that there might have been a book with a similar title referring to another subject once upon a time. David Cameron once said that he took the book home. He told Conservative Party conference that he took the book home and had tried it out with Samantha and it doesn't work, which was probably one of the worst jokes made at a Conservative Party conference ever. But the book does include the introduction to the ideas that I'm going to be talking about tonight, which I fundamentally worked out for myself, which are modern monetary theory. But there is, if I'm honest, now you can see I've got loads of props to support me, a better description This is The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. She is an American economist. She is very closely associated with, well, not only the Biden campaign, but before that, really the Sanders campaign. Stephanie's book is well worth reading. It's out in paperback in March, which will reduce the price. Stephanie and I get on. I actually am one of the endorsers on the back cover. So, you know, we've talked to each other quite a bit. A modern monetary theory is, in a sense, what I want to talk about. But I want to talk about it because of the impact that it has upon those things that I'm passionate about: environment, economics, how we're going to make a sustainable society, how we're going to change the world so that we have a living long-term economics, when frankly throughout my life to date we have not. We've had an economics which is all about bringing our planet to crisis. And there's a fundamental difference between modern monetary theory and most economics. And it's slightly bizarre in a sense, because one of the things that, despite its name, modern monetary theory is really good at is ignoring money. It explains the role of money, but at the same time, it says that unlike every other economic system that you will have ever been taught and ever heard a politician talk about, including neoliberalism and including Marxism and including most other things in between, and there's quite a number of varieties and flavors of economics that you can find around the world, but most of those focus upon the availability of money and treat money as the thing that is in short supply when we look at an economy to say whether we can do something or not. And modern monetary theory actually says that's not true. The thing that is in short supply is actually the resources that are available to us that we can use if this planet is to survive. So actually, MMT and the Green New Deal were born to go together. And indeed, that's really what happened when in 2017, when the Americans, you know, AOC and her team, the squad, really picked this idea up, put it into Democrat politics, began to literally send it around the world, bizarrely re-importing it into the UK, from which it originated, via the States. And the logic is quite simply that we don't have a constraint which is imposed by money, and I'll explain why in a minute. We do have a constraint which is imposed by the number of people who are available to work in an economy. And as far as I'm concerned, and I actually can't see the copy of this book, which I was, oh, I have got it. As far as I'm concerned, there's another constraint, which is that we can only use the finite resources that are available to us in a generation, so that we leave the planet to the next generation with at least as good a prospect of their long-term survival as we had, which actually I explained some economic theory about that in that book called The Courageous State. Nobody ever reads the nice bit of theory in the middle, which has got some pretty horrendous diagrams, you know, lots and lots of circles trying to explain limits to growth, and people skip the middle bit for that reason, I'm told. Nobody's ever read those chapters. They read the beginning and the end. So I'm concerned about this limit to growth. I literally go back to that first ever book that I read. It's quite astonishing that I read a book at the age of 15, which has influenced a great deal of my thinking ever since. Because we are constrained. All economics is about how we allocate scarce resources. That is the economic problem. And what I suggest the problem is that we are constrained by the fact that we must not overconsume. Now, that doesn't mean to say, and I'm actually, in a sense, I'm not an anti-growther. I mean, there are those who are my friends in XR and various places who are quite concerned about the idea of growth and say we can't have growth, we must have degrowth. But actually, my argument is I don't think there are any limits to the amount we can care for each other. And if that requires us sometimes to exchange money for care, so what? I don't think there are any limits to the number of songs that we can play to each other, though not always by ABBA. I think that we can actually literally entertain each other. And if that requires us to pay the person who's on, you know, the stage or wherever else, I'm totally happy about that. Is that going to consume much carbon? No. It's actually normally a very low carbon activity. I think that there are lots of things that we can do for our intellectual well-being, our emotional well-being, and our sense of purpose, which do not require us to consume the planet. But we've forgotten those things. So at the core of my intellectual economic thinking is the fact that we are and should not be materialists. We should be looking for the greater whole. Now, how does that fit into this idea of modern monetary theory and financing a Green New Deal, which is what it was said tonight was going to be about? Modern monetary theory turns most ideas in conventional economics, what people call neoliberal economics, which is officially more likely and properly called neoclassical economics, and which is very similar whether you are technically from the left or the right. Most Keynesians are remarkably right-wing. They believe in markets, they believe in the power of markets, they believe in the right of markets to allocate resources. They tend to underestimate the importance of what an economist would call externalities, which you might call pollution, and you might also call other things which we consider undesirable, like health impacts. So they tend to undervalue those things because they think markets are efficient. The only difference between really right-wing economists and left-wing economists is actually how long they think it takes for markets to work, and recognize that the right-wing think that markets always work, and the left-wing think that because markets take a long time to react, they can be suboptimal for quite a period of time before they get to the point which economists call equilibrium. Well, I've got to tell you, there's no such thing as equilibrium. I don't even want there to be equilibrium. I have never been in a point which is perfect for very long in my life. I don't want to be stuck at a point and think, that's it, this is perfection, there's nothing else to look forward to. We live in dynamic lives which are always lived going forward, and we always have to accept change. So I don't even believe this premise of most neoclassical economics that somehow we're going to reach a point of perfection which we're never going to change. We're not. We're always on a journey. Not just strictly come dancing that has journeys, so too does economics. And what modern monetary theory says is money is not a constraint if properly managed in that process of helping us achieve these goals in life. Now, there are conditions attached to this properly managed. And the conditions are that we must live in a country where there is an effective and functioning government. Modern monetary theory does not work in most developing countries because I'm afraid to say there are not very strong and not very effective governments in certainly some of the countries with which I'm very familiar. And there must be a properly functioning tax system which is pretty much free of corruption, or else actually MMT can't work. Quite bizarrely, MMT is quite heavily dependent on tax in a way that is unusual, and which I'll come back to in a minute. And there must be a country with its own currency and its own central bank. And very importantly, the country must not borrow in any other currency than its own. Now, a lot of developing countries, for example, fail at this point because they are forced by their lenders to borrow in dollars. Whatever their own currency is, they have to borrow in dollars because people don't trust their own currencies. They want dollars back. And so most developing countries, unfortunately, can't use MMT. This is a rich countries club, I'm afraid to say at the moment, description of how economics works. MMT is not a very good theory because it's not really theory, it's description. It's actually, this is what happens. And what MMT realized, and which I had already realized, and when I began to work with the likes of Stephanie, got to this point. Is someone trying to tell me I'm running out of time already? No? Okay. Then what happens is we are and have been brought up to think that we live in an economy where governments must tax and then they spend. And what MMT says is that's not true. We live in an economy where a government must spend to be able to tax. And this is completely revolutionary. I'm actually looking for my next prop by leaning forwards, I promise you. My next prop is one of those. Yeah, I know it's not a Scottish one, but I don't have a Scottish one. But you'll recognize it nonetheless. It's a note. And MMT has observed the fact that every government that is effective around the world always asks that tax be paid using the government's own currency. But the question that should arise, this is the chicken and the egg question, if you like. How can you pay tax using the government's currency if there is no currency in existence? How does the first currency get there? How does currency always get there? And the answer is, in fact, that unless the government spends first, literally In days of old, the king, almost invariably, there were occasions otherwise, but normally kings, wanted to go to war. They turned gold into coins. They gave gold coins to their soldiers went to war, they spent the money, and the kings, who wanted to keep the money recycling, imposed a tax and insisted that the tax was paid in their currency, so they reclaimed the gold and they spent it again. Now, this is the system of money that existed until 1970, when Richard Nixon, those who are old enough to remember dear old Tricky Dicky, as he was called, by those who knew him well, I'm told, abolished the thing called the gold standard, literally meaning that money was gold. And but the point was clear. The spend had to come first. The king or the government had to spend the money into existence, and then the tax could happen to reclaim it. Nothing, I promise you, has changed, except that since 1970, this stuff has nothing to back it up. That is a worthless piece of plasticized paper. It has no other use whatsoever than pretending that it's worth 20 quid. It isn't worth £20. They cost about 10p to produce if you have the right machinery. But if you don't have the right machinery and you try to do it, you go to prison. So I don't recommend it. But it is literally a promise to pay. And what MMT says is, this is all money is about. It's just a promise. And the government can make as many promises as it likes. It's a bit like love. There is no limit to the amount of love you can have in the world. And actually, I think that's probably true. Anybody who's a parent here will will understand the phenomenon that you think you've given all your love to your first child, and then a second one comes along and you realize, God, I can love that one just as much. Isn't that amazing? And you can actually do that, and you can make promises to pay. And all the government does when it spends money into the economy is promise to pay people. The reason why people accept that their promise is good is not because they collected tax first, but because the government insists you have to pay your taxes using their money. And to make sure that their money goes around in the economy, therefore, you use it as a matter of fact to spend. Now, that means that the government who actually does have, and I listed those conditions earlier, if the government has got an effective currency, an effective central bank, an effective tax system, law and order, and can therefore collect the money back, it can control its economy. Now, a government that can control its economy is quite a scary thing to right-wingers, because they think markets control the economy. What's really frightening to right-wingers is that what MMT says is that a government with these conditions in place can control the economy. And we have seen this of late. Governments can create money at will, any amount of it. In fact, since 2009, the government has created over £800 billion worth of new money. They call it quantitative easing. Don't worry that it's called quantitative easing, call it QE for short. There's a hell of a lot of T's in quantitative, and you have to learn how to say it before you speak in public about it, because otherwise you just end up doing all sorts of weird things with it. But QE is simply the government creating new money, which it injects into the economy and has never tried to cancel, nor has it tried to tax it back, and nor will it do so. Because if it did, literally at the moment, increasing taxes, and you will hear the debate, how are we going to pay for the coronavirus crisis? We've already paid for it. There is nothing owing. The government created the money to pay for the coronavirus crisis using QE. And unless you want to literally tear up all those notes that it has in effect created, they're in bank accounts. I used to tear the notes up, but of course now they're plastic and they don't tear up. It's really annoying. But at this point in the past, I would tear up a note and everyone would go horrified about this, particularly a student audience who thought I'd removed the possibility of going to the pub with that note. You don't, you just sellotape it back together again, and Tesco's always took them, as I knew, because I did it many times. Many notes suffered in the course of giving presentations like this in the past. But the point is that money was worthless, but the government claims it back. And it does it to simply control inflation. You can't print money forever, otherwise you get inflation. You end up with Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic or whatever. So there's a delicate balancing act around money, but the point is the government controls this. And the point is that that means the government can decide to deliver full employment. The government can decide to fund the NHS. The government can decide to deliver a Green New Deal. The government can decide to control interest rates. Because when the government's actually got so much money out there that it owns, because actually it spent £800 billion to cancel £800 billion of its own debt technically. So 40% of the government debt about which we are paranoid about repaying is already owned by the government. They control the interest rates in the economy, and they can keep them at the official interest rate, which, if anybody's familiar at the moment, the official interest rate is 0.1%. Now, that basically means the government can spend costlessly. There is no cost to the government creating money. In fact, inflation is higher than 0.1%. Therefore, actually, somebody who saves money with the government, and over £1 trillion of money is saved with the government at the moment, is actually losing by lending money to the government, but they still do it because it's the safest place to save. So people want to save with the government. So spending at the moment is something the government has complete liberty to decide upon. Now, we are in a very odd economic situation at the moment. I hardly need to tell you that. COVID has created a crisis which is unlike even the 2008 crisis. And what it means is that we have to decide now how we're going to recover from this situation and what choices we're going to make. And we, of course, know at the same time we're heading for COP26 later this year, hopefully, live or not, in Glasgow or not. There's going to be a COP26, I think, and we have to make critical decisions about the future. We have to decide whether our whole economy is going to become sustainable. We have to decide, are we going for a Green New Deal? We have to decide, are we going to decarbonize? We have to decide whether we put the pressure on business to change, and all those other things. My point is that so long as there are people in the economy who can be put to work to deliver this program, and we are going to face mass unemployment later this year, because when furlough ends, the pretense that we don't have mass unemployment is going to disappear. And at some point, furlough is going to end. And we're going to see millions of people unemployed who need jobs. The government could literally carry on creating money to put those people to work to deliver a Green New Deal. Now, there is a problem. The real problem is actually this new money does actually end up in the economy. And it actually ends up as extra savings. When the government runs a deficit, somebody has to run a surplus. That's double entry bookkeeping. If there's any accountants on the call, well, I'm sorry, I'm not the only one in that case, but there always has to be two sides to an entry in accounting. And when some people save, some people must borrow. The government is effectively borrowing by creating new money. I promise you that's how it works. Somebody must therefore be saving. The rich are getting very much richer at the moment. Even the moderately rich are getting very much richer. Because somebody like me, I haven't been to London since last March. I used to go 3 times a week. I'm not paying to go to London anymore. Now I literally sit at home. I've saved effectively. Well, apart from the fact my income's gone down significantly because of a change of university, minor issue. But in theory, I've saved. So those people are actually having more money to save. We do have a crisis, which is too many savings in the world at the moment. You might find that hard to imagine, particularly if you're having problems making the books balance by the end of the week. But there's a lot of people who've got so much money at the moment, they don't know what to do with it. So we do have to also not just think about how we put resources to use, and those resources are people, physical and aligned with planet, but we have to stop the risk of money running out of control while we do it. And that's literally money running out of control because of extra inequality in society, because there's too much money floating around. And that we have to control by changing the way that we require savings in our economy. So with Colin Hines, who I've worked with for many years, an environmentalist who I think Matthew knew of old, and others might do, who's written books on localism and various things. He's the coordinator of the Green New Deal group. We wrote a paper a year or so ago about how to change the tax system to recapture through the tax system without taxing these excess savings. And all we said was very simple. Unbelievably, £70 billion a year goes into ISA accounts, individual savings accounts in the UK. Suppose they were just literally required to be saved in Green New Deal bonds. That money had to be recycled into literally paying for new housing, new infrastructure, the ability to build, wind turbines in Scotland in a way that I'm afraid the Scottish government has not supported as well as I might wish. I'm quite willing to be critical of the Scottish government and any government who doesn't do what I want, who have not invested in the physical infrastructure of insulation, which most properties still need. And I know that insulation is not possible in walls without cavities. And I know Scotland's got a lot of those, but there could be double glazing or triple glazing. There could be more solar panels. There could be lots of opportunities. Scotland has the potential, of course, to be the Saudi Arabia of Europe. It has more potential wind power than any other country in Europe, but it's not being developed. This money could be redirected, and so could pension money. The wealthy get 40% of everything they pay into their pensions refunded by the government. Suppose as a condition for this tax relief, at least a quarter of all new money going into pension funds a year was required to go into, again, green investment. That would be an additional 25 billion a year. Now, the Commonweal think tank, who I've worked with in Scotland and know quite well, I reckon that their figures for the cost of doing a Green New Deal in Scotland, they have one of the best formulated Green New Deal plans of any organisation in UK and Europe, as far as I can see, by the way. It's a really good plan. Extrapolate that for the UK, and we couldn't spend more than 100 billion a year on funding a Green New Deal programme, nor do we have enough people available to spend more than that. And I can just find it from ISAs and from the pension system in its own right. Change the tax laws, I can fund a whole new Green New Deal. Done. As my children say, Dad, if you can find 100 billion so easily, why A, do we live in this fairly modest house, and B, why don't I have a Ferrari? That's they have a Ferrari, not me. I don't want a Ferrari. My answer to them is tough. I might be able to find 100 billion for doing sustainability, but I can't find the money for you. Absolutely true. But we can literally find this money. And that is what MMT has liberated me to understand, that money is not a constraint on our choices, and nor are markets, because the government can now control bond markets. It can control interest rates because it knows that it can always buy back bonds if the bond markets decide to play up. Instead, the government is in control. It has the option of making the choices that are necessary to deliver sustainability. So this is my message, that we can be in charge. We can deliver a Green New Deal. We can do it by changing our understanding of money. We can do it by changing our understanding of the way that the tax system interacts. And we can do it by understanding the real constraint is how we use the resources, the real resources that are you, are me, and the world around us to achieve this goal. I hope that's okay. And I already see there are questions, and I'd love to answer them already, but I think we've got other plans already.
No, we have some time for questions, which is great. And folks, that was really interesting, Richard. Thank you. Some of it, I will admit, went completely over my head. And so don't be afraid to ask sort of simple questions as well as more complex ones. This is supposed to be for people who don't necessarily get economics. So what's it, daft laddie and lassie questions are very welcome. Okay, so the first question came up was about new currency theory. Can you kind of encapsulate for us what that is? I'm trying to see
where that question is. Where's that?
It's from Richard at 8 p.m. I read a critique of modern monetary theory by Huber, arguing that new currency theory was better. It seems convincing, but might be just an academic trying to be clever.
I have no idea what new currency theory is, so I can't answer your question. I'm sorry. I do occasionally listen to Nick Huber's podcast. I've not heard that one. So I'm not able to answer it. I can see somebody saying a good point about money out of $100 trillion note. It's worthless. I wonder which currency that was, probably Zimbabwe. And it would be worthless because Zimbabwe is a failed state. You can print money. There is no problem in printing money. We've done 800 billion of it, as I said. But if you have a country that can't control its own economy, it can't control its own tax system, it can't control the corruption within that society, then printing too much money means it can't reclaim it through the tax system, and therefore you do end up with chaos. So a good tax system is necessary in MMT, not because it pays for the spending is paid for by creating money. as quantitative easing proves. But you have to have the tax system to create the balance within that society. Otherwise, it doesn't work. I'm sorry, I genuinely don't know what Jacobus had to say. I mean, I know a bit of his work, but I genuinely don't know this term, new currency theory.
That's okay.
Are Green New Deal bonds similar to war bonds? Yes, if you like. They are. They are, in a sense, a form of hypothecated saving. I've got no problem with that. I have a problem with hypothecated taxation because it doesn't really work. But hypothecated saving is taking money out of the... There are two types of money, and this again is quite complex. There's government created money and there's bank created money, and they circulate quite differently. You actually have this stuff, which is actually, that's printed by the Treasury, but it circulates through banks. So the government has a money cycle, and then there's the financial cycle, which exists outside that. And what the government doesn't want to do at the moment is take money out of the banking financial cycle, because in fact, there's a shortage of money in our economy at the moment in some ways, because there's been a shortage of bank lending. I know there's been bank lending to support businesses who are losing money, but net terms, there's been a shortage of bank lending. All money is created by lending, either by the government lending to itself, which is how the Bank of England creates money. It lends money to the government, or by banks lending money out to individuals. That's the only way we can create money, because money is a promise to pay. It even says on this note, I promise to pay the bearer. It's just a promise to pay. And so lending creates money. There's been a shortage of it. So the government doesn't want to take money out of the financial system at the moment, not too much by tax or by issuing new bonds. Both of those bring money out of the financial system and back into the government money system. So what instead we need to do is redirect money which is already in the financial system, money which actually, as I said, people have saved, into a productive use. Instead, that money at the moment is being used for unproductive use. That unproductive use is pushing up house prices, not desirable. I hear they're pretty high in Leith at the moment. I happen to have a goddaughter who's just bought a house in, or not a house, an apartment in Leith, and a pretty small one at that. As I gather it, I will come and see it at some time soon, I hope, but not yet. I also know that, of course, the stock market is running at what are really ridiculously high valuations. So the financial assets are very highly valued. Bitcoin has been near its all-time record. Property is really high. This is an unproductive use of money. What Green New Deal bonds is trying to do is drag that money out of unproductive allocation of savings into productive allocation of savings by funding the change that we want in society. So that's, yes, they are. And I would actually pay a better rate of interest than the average, which is available from financial markets, to support it too. At the moment, if 1% was offered on a Green New Deal bond, there would be queues down the street to buy them, because nobody can get 1% on money at the moment, which is quite ridiculous. If you're of a certain age, the idea that somebody would queue up to get 1% return on their money is crazy. What are the biggest criticisms of MMT? Well, the biggest criticisms are it's not much about money. Yes, I admit that, because it's actually about real resource allocation. It's not very modern. No, it's actually based in Keynesian economics. And it's not a theory, true, it's a description. There is no country that is implementing MMT, but every country does MMT. Remember, it's a description. It's not a policy description. It doesn't say what you do. It describes what you've done. MMT describes how government money is created and circulates in the economy. It does allow a government to take control of its economy. A government doesn't have to if it doesn't want to. It does allow a government to direct how money is spent to achieve its social goals. It doesn't have to if a government doesn't want to. So MMT isn't a policy description, but it frequently is used to explain how we can achieve full employment. But to think that it actually is a government implementing MMT doesn't happen. MMT is happening in the UK right now. It is literally describes how the Bank of England operates every single day. Can anybody do it but a state? No, this is a very important point. I have to make this point, which is really important. If you don't have your own currency in your own central bank, you cannot be in control of your economy. That's one of the things MMT very clearly says. If you do not have your own currency, you use somebody else's currency, then you are out of control of your economy. Now, there is an obvious political point, which I think may be clear to most people here, that I am trying to walk around very carefully at the moment. But there is a debate about whether, of course, Scotland will have its own currency after independence, and I am involved in the independence movement. So I'll put my hands up. I'm writing policy for independence groups. Scotland will not be independent without its own currency. Let's be straightforward, clear, abundantly obvious. If you try and use sterling as Nicola Sturgeon's friends would like to, Scotland will remain basically completely under the control of London. So you have to do that. Are there any cities who are pursuing pensions or ISAs in the way you'd outlined? No, but one of the things that we could do is demand the right that Scotland could do that. I believe Scotland should be demanding the right to be able to issue its own ISA accounts as a devolved power. And it should be demanding the right so that pension contributions made within the Scottish income tax system, and of course there is a Scottish income tax system now. Let's be clear, there is. You know, you have a Scottish Revenue Authority. Then there should be that condition capable of being applied in Scotland, even if it is not applied in England. And I believe that's a very good campaigning point within Scotland. I know you said at the beginning we aren't meant to think about campaigning. I can't not think about campaigning. That's what I do all the time. So I'm really sorry, Ava. I know you told us we weren't meant to do that, but for me, everything turns into how can we actually come up with a solution to the world? Hasn't QE inflated property prices? Yes. Should we be taxing wealth rather than income? We should be taxing the income from wealth very much more than we tax the income from employment at the moment. And there is a massive imbalance in society. I agree we need to reorientate that. I've written plenty of papers about it. I'm writing a paper about how Scotland should have a tax system right now. It'll be published in April, and that will be one of the key features of it. We clearly undertax wealth. We need to rebalance that. Not because we need the money to pay for things, remember, because spending is paid for by the government asking for money from its central bank, but because it is fair to ask when we're reclaiming money from the economy to have more from the wealthiest, simply because they're wealthy. And actually that creates imbalances in society that we don't want. And so we do need to tax wealth more. One critique of the Green New Deal is it doesn't address extractivist nature of West's relationship with the global South. I agree entirely. We clearly do need to use fewer resources. We actually need to give those economies in the global South power of their economies in the way I'm describing. They actually need to be able to run MMT. If they did, they would not have to sell their natural resources for dollars to service their dollar-denominated international debt, which is why they do it now, which is why they become utterly dependent upon selling gold, iron ore, whatever it might be. And I've seen more contracts for those types of things. I've worked closely with Global Witness on how to reform those types of contracts over the years. The best one I ever did was Liberia, where I got a contract cancelled and it cost Mittal Steel $50 million simply to reopen the negotiation. It was the biggest one-off donation I got from a large company to a particular country because they made a mistake in a contract and I exposed it. Have we been on the gold standard since off since 1970? Yeah, I know technically we came off in the 1930s, but we had a fixed exchange rate with the dollar, and the dollar was on the gold standard, so effectively we remained on it. Do I see local currencies as being any use? I'm afraid not. I don't. Why? Because they're not acceptable for payment of tax. So they always have to have a fixed conversion rate. So they would be exactly the same as the Scottish pound would be if you use sterling as the basis for the Scottish currency. So they don't provide that liberating opportunity. They do allow, I admit this, they do allow circulation of money within a closed community. And in that sense, they can be quite useful. And there are examples. The Bristol pound, for example, does seem to have worked in that way. And I do understand why the Green New Deal has supported that, but it's a very, very micro level policy. It's not a macro solution. I've got another 29 messages apparently, which I haven't read. I don't think that's true. How much longer should I be reading through all these before I stop and you do a breakout group and I go and make a cup of tea, perhaps?
Great job. Got about 5 more minutes, so maybe two couple more questions.
Okay. Would Scotland be able to pursue MMT and join the EU? Yes. The real question is, would Scotland be able to pursue MMT and join the euro? No. Do you have to join the euro to join the EU? No, you don't. That's a myth which is put around by a lot of people. You have to promise to join the euro. You don't have to join it though. The example is Sweden, and not only Sweden, but Sweden is the longest running example. Sweden promised to join the euro in 1995. To join the euro, it would have to change one bit of law about its central bank. Mysteriously, for 25 years, it's forgotten to change that law. And so it can't join the euro. And it hasn't, and it has no intention of changing that law. And Europe has not got upset about it. So you promise to join and you don't do it. It's the longest running engagement with the euro that there's ever been. They've never consummated that relationship with the euro, and nor do they ever intend to. And good on them, because the euro is a disaster. So Scotland should never join the euro. It should have its own currency as an independent nation. But I've got no problems with actually it joining the European Union. I admit I'm a Remainer and always have been. What shifts in the economy what would I look for to create full employment? Oh, look, the Green New Deal is my description. I mean, what I want to release is something that Colin and I call a carbon army. The carbon army is literally the people on the ground who are going to do the work to transform the economy. The people who are going to build the local transport infrastructure, which we need, because it's going to be different from cars. Or if it is cars, it's going to need all those electricity recharging points. It's the people who are fitting the triple glazing. It's the people who are putting the solar panels in. It's the people who are installing wind farms or whatever, or tidal farms. All those people have to work locally. The thing about green power is it's local by definition. It's always near you. And we believe that that is the way to create jobs of long-term value. These jobs are going to last for years and years and years. I'm not talking about some job training scheme for something which isn't going to be of value. It's going to be there for the long term. And that's why I'm interested in this, because I believe this creates long-term opportunity. At the same time, and I'm aware of this, a lot of those jobs sound, and I'm not being sexist, but they appear to be rather male in orientation. We do also need to have at the same time a recognition, and COVID has taught us this, we are under-resourced on health, we're under-resourced on care, and we're under-resourced on education. So we will have to invest in those things as well. Are we going to have a stock market crash sometime? Yes. Do you want me to elaborate?
No.
It's overvalued. I mean, it's as blunt as that. There's just too much money in it. There will be an adjustment. I believe it's 6,600-ish at the moment. If it's worth more than 4,000 on the FTSE, I'm astonished. I have none of my pension fund in the stock market for very, very deliberate reason. And my own pension fund is under my control because I've been self-employed most of my life. I hope I've covered most of the questions that I've seen. If I haven't, come back to me later.
I think you've done an amazing job, Richard. Thank you very much. That was that was quite phenomenal, actually.
I never know where I'm going when I start speaking. My lectures were like that with students. I never knew what a lecture was going to be.
Wind you up and point you in a direction.
Yeah, vaguely.
Anyway, really appreciate that. And you're going to be staying with us till
I'll stay around and I'll join one of your breakout groups as well.
Fantastic.
Unless you don't want me to, folks. If you don't want me in your breakout group, tell me to go away, okay? If I end up in your group.
It's like the lucky dip. Someone's gonna get their prize. So yes, breakout groups is now. They're really for us to have conversations that we want to have. Not all of us will have Richard, and we have come up with one or two questions which you may want to spark conversation in your breakout groups, or you may be absolutely happy. You find a topic between you want to talk about and you go ahead. So Matthew, have you got a note of those?
Yes, I just posted them in the chat.
I'm not seeing them.
I can't see them, Matthew.
Oh, well, I can see them and posted in the chat.
Oh, very strange.
We'll just try once more. Ah, there we go. Can you see them now?
Ah, yes, I can. Yeah. I am going to make a cup of tea for a second.
That's great. And we've got about 25 minutes in the breakout groups.